We want to welcome Ryan Rydzewski today to talk about what every parent, grandparent, and teacher is really concerned about these days, and that is that we're losing our connections to our kids. And Ryan and Gregg Behr have written a wonderful book called When You Wonder, You're Learning. Hi, Ryan.
Thank you so much for having me, Doris. It's a pleasure to be here.
Ryan, well, chief concerns are that we are really just losing connections, but you have some good answers. So what has caused us to disconnect with our kids?
You know, it's interesting. I think kids today are growing up in a world that is so fundamentally different, even on a year by year basis, that we don't always think about how they're seeking affirmation differently, how they are developing their identities differently. Gregg, my co-author, often talks about when he first started his job. We both work in education and philanthropy. He talked to teachers who said, I'm just not connecting with kids like I used to. And they would say that in 2006. And then the very next year, they'd say it again in 2007 and 2008. And it just seemed like it was getting harder and harder with each passing year to maintain those connections. And that's for all sorts of reasons, right? We have new technologies that kids are exposed to very early on. We have new pressures that kids have to react to. We have the world sometimes even looks different physically. Just outside my window today, we have smoke from the wildfires surrounding, drifting down here to Pittsburgh, which was Fred's real life neighborhood. So it's not so much that kids themselves are different. Kids in many ways are the same as they've always been, but the stimuli, the world, the environment in which they have to react to is so much different than the one that we adults grew up in. And that's true today, but it was also true in Fred's time to a degree. So kids were exposed to television for the very first time, not too long after Fred himself grew up. When he first saw television, he was horrified. He thought he really didn't like it. He saw people throwing pies in each other's faces.
But before we get into Fred, because this book is really inspired by Fred Rogers and the TV series Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. Okay,
absolutely.
Yeah. So tell us again about what for those people who don't remember Mr. Rogers. Tell us a little bit about who he was and what his primary goal for this 1970s series.
Sure. So Fred grew up about 30 miles from where I'm sitting now in Pittsburgh. He grew up in a little town called Latrobe, Pennsylvania. And he first discovered television on spring break. He was home from college and he was a budding musician at the time. He had studied piano in college down in Florida. And he came home and he saw this strange glowing box in his parents' living room. And the first thing he ever saw, like I said, was people throwing pies in each other's faces. And he hated to see technology being used to demean other people. And so when Fred eventually decided to go into the seminary, he went to what is now the Pittsburgh Theological Seminary. And he decided, I'm going to use this new technology that I don't even personally like very much, but I'm going to use it to connect with kids, because he could tell right away that this was immensely attractive to children. He knew it was going to be everywhere. And within a decade, he was right. TV was in some 90% of households. But no one had ever done that before. There had never been a TV minister. There had never been anyone who used technology in this way. And so his teachers at the seminary said, Fred, if you want to do that, it's great. It's a very inventive idea, but you better go study something about child development too. And so that's what he did. On his lunch breaks from the television station, he would go down and he would study with a woman named Dr. Margaret McFarland, who's one of the world's leading experts on child development. And he took what he learned from her, and from all sorts of other experts, and he blended it with songs and stories and puppetry, building what eventually became this television program that you can see on the poster behind me, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. So that was a children's program that aired from 1968 to 2001, almost 40 years, more than 900 episodes. It's just sort of astounding how much work went into it and how he was able to sustain that energy for so long. And of course, this television program was watched and loved by millions and millions of kids, including me and Gregg.
And so now in your book, you really talk about raising creative, curious, caring children. And you talk about what kids will need to thrive. What are some of the lessons that you're teaching in this book and that Mr. Rogers taught?
Sure. Yeah. So we wanted to elevate, I think, an underappreciated aspect of Fred's legacy. So if you remember Mr. Rogers, if any of your listeners remember Mr. Rogers, they probably remember him for the way he made them feel, right? He made us all feel special, and he made us all feel accepted and safe. But he was so much more than that kindly, nice man in a sweater. He was definitely that. And we love to learn about Fred's life, but most people don't know that Fred was really a scientist. I mean, he really knew his stuff when it came to child development. And so what we're trying to outline in this book is what are the things that Fred was nurturing in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. And those things are what Fred called his tools for learning. So curiosity, creativity, communication, collaboration, celebration, and connection. And what's really amazing about these 6 tools for learning is that today, if you talk to learning scientists, modern day digital age scientists, if you ask them what it is that children need to thrive, they are those very same things. And in many ways, Fred was nurturing those tools in ways that were decades ahead of his time. So we're trying to elevate Fred the scientist and show parents and teachers and anyone who works with kids that Mr. Rogers' neighborhood in many ways can be more than a pleasant memory in the minds of us adults, right? It's also a resource. It's something that if we study as parents or as teachers can help us point the way forward for kids and equip them with the tools they need to thrive.
And one of your chapters is on curiosity, and you mentioned that we are losing curiosity, or that we're becoming less inquisitive. So how do you help us become more inquisitive?
We take a page from Fred. So if you pick any one of those 900 episodes of Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and you pick any scene from those 900 episodes, you'll almost certainly find Fred wondering about something. You'll find him talking about how many questions he has, or talking about how much he wants to know about the world. He sings a song called Did You Know? And that's actually where the title of our book comes from. Did you know when you wonder, you're learning? Fred really understood how important it was to show children that he's a learner too, that he still has questions, that he still wonders about the world. He knew that that was infectious. In fact, he used to tell parents, it's what you bring to the children every day that encourages and inspires children to ask questions and to be imaginative. We don't even have to have all the answers, but when we respond thoughtfully to children's questions, we're letting them know that it's good to wonder and ask. And I think, it's important to keep that in mind because life is so fast now that it's often easier. I think we say this in the book. If our kids come home and they have tons of questions, sometimes it's easier to say, I don't know. I don't have time for this right now. Or maybe go ask your mother. Or even, let's get out the iPad and we'll just distract you away from those questions. It can become really easy to discourage children's questions, even if we don't mean to do it. And so it's really important for us adults, whether we're parents or teachers, to keep that curiosity alive. And the best way to do it is to model it. And we got that from Fred every day.
Well, and then one of the things that I like about this book is that in each chapter, you end it with, what might you do? And so what's all that about? What are you telling us there?
I'm so happy that you mentioned that you like those sections, Doris, because when we first turned in the manuscript to our publisher, those sections were not there. Gregg and I really didn't want, he sometimes says, we didn't want this to be parenting for dummies because we're not expert parents. My son's only a year old. Gregg's daughters are fairly young as well. We really wanted it to be focused on Fred. And our publisher said, Fred wasn't just a researcher. He was a practitioner. Every day he was bridging research and practice, and you all need to do the same thing. So our compromise was, rather than it being advice from me and Gregg, who, we're still learning ourselves, we're going to go out and we're going to ask experts, what is it that they do that might spark ideas in some readers? So one of our favorite examples from those What Might You Do sections comes from that first chapter on curiosity. And we were asking Hedda Sherapin what are some simple things we might do to keep curiosity alive in our kids? And Hedda worked with Fred all the way back from the very first day of production in the late 1960s. If you've ever seen Morgan Neville's amazing documentary, Hedda is interviewed in that. She's just an amazing teacher, an amazing person. And she gave us the example of an ask it basket. So she walked into a classroom and she noticed at the front of the classroom, there was just a wicker basket, which she thought was interesting. And what she realized the teacher was doing was that when kids were asking questions in this classroom, sometimes they really didn't have all that much to do with the lesson at hand. And any of your listeners who were teachers have probably had this experience. Kids ask all sorts of wild questions, and they're sometimes really great questions, but they're sometimes not all that relevant. Now, instead of saying, as I just said earlier, I don't really have time for that, or go ask somebody else, that teacher did something really remarkable. She took a moment to notice the question. She would write that question down on a Post-it note, and then she would put that Post-it note in the ask it basket. And she said, together later, we're going to wonder about that. And it was that little simple action that showed kids, again, that their questions matter. And so that's something that teachers can do. Gregg has a little ask it basket now set up on his kitchen table that he uses with his kids. So we tried to find little simple ideas that can help, readers follow in Fred's footsteps, each in their own way.
That's great. Well, now you remind us that all humans are really born to be creative, but along the way, we've really stopped indulging in that creativity. Yeah. So what's the lesson for teachers and parents in that chapter? What?
Yeah. There's an amazing study at the beginning of that chapter. There's a guy named George Land who studied this, and he developed a test for NASA in the late 1960s. NASA, of course, was a big deal at the time. They had just landed on the moon, and they were trying to recruit more astronauts, and they needed creative people. So he developed a test of creativity that, just for fun, he gave to 5-year-olds. And he found that 98% of those 5-year-olds were so creative that by NASA standards, they were creative geniuses. Wow. Now, but when those kids turned 10, the share of creative geniuses fell from 98% to 30%. And when they turned 15, it fell from 30% to 12%. And by the time these kids had grown up, it had fallen from 98% to 2%. It was a total reversal. Oh. And what Land concluded wasn't that creativity naturally fades with age. We're not doomed to become less creative just by fact of growing up. But we learn to become less creative as we get older, because as we become more self-critical, as we begin to worry more about what other people are saying of us, as we begin to worry about how we're going to be perceived, we become less expressive, right? We become less open to new ideas and new ways of thinking about the world. One of my favorite facts we discovered about this was that in some comedy clubs, front row seats are actually discounted because people don't want to sit there because they're terrified of having to become part of the show, right? We're scared of creativity when we get older. And so again, this goes back in Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. It always started with Fred. Fred is probably the only adult most of us have ever seen who sits at his kitchen table by himself and he's cutting things out of construction paper, right? And he's painting pictures of butterflies and he's playing in a sandbox. Whatever it is he's doing, even if it's childish to other adults, he's always making it clear how much joy that creative pursuit brings him, right? He always looks like he's having a blast. And then he brought in all sorts of creative people, Yo-Yo Ma and Julia Child, Wynton Marsalis, people who are absolute masters of their craft. But Fred never focused on their accomplishments, right? The awards they won. Instead, he focused on the joy they got out of the creative process, right? Who is it that helped them? Who inspired them? How did they fall in love with cooking or playing the trumpet or whatever it is that they went on and did? He was always showing us that creativity isn't just for kids. He was surrounding us with creative adults day in and day out and showing us that, again, we're going to be tempted to get away from those things that make us happy, those creative pursuits that enrich our lives, but we don't have to give them up. And Mr. Rogers and the people he brought into the neighborhood, they were proof that we don't have to give them up.
Wow. So the lesson, I guess, is to take time for your own creative self.
Absolutely. Yes. Fred used to say that the best teacher in the world is the one who loves what he or she does and just loves it in front of children. And I think it's true for a lot of adults that whatever it is that we love to do, whether it's hiking or painting or singing or playing the guitar, we kind of get away from that sometimes as adults. We don't often do the things that we love most. And it's so important, Fred understood, not only for adults to do those things, but to do them in front of kids and to show them how much joy it brings us.
Ah, yes. Well, and you have a long chapter on working together. What are the ingredients for an effective team, family or work?
The most important thing we learned, and this was surprising to me in researching this chapter, the most important thing is psychological safety. And psychological safety, this actually comes from studies of businesses. Psychological safety is the idea that when you're on a team, you have to feel respected enough and safe enough to be able to speak your mind, right? You have to really be able to bring your full self to that team. That means you have to be allowed to get things wrong and you're not going to be ridiculed. It means you have to be able to have, maybe you're the one person in 10 with a different opinion. You have to be able to bring that up because when you do, it makes the entire team better. Studies have found that when people on teams feel psychologically safe, they perform better as individuals and the team performs better overall. And this has actually been replicated in classrooms. The safer kids feel in a classroom, that they won't be taunted by their fellow students or by their teachers, that they won't get in trouble for making mistakes, that they'll be celebrated for trying, not necessarily for the end outcome. Kids learn better, they do better on tests, they're happier, and the teams work better together. So it's sort of way of approaching collaboration that I don't think we always talk explicitly about. We talk about teamwork, but we don't talk about how to make individual members of teams feel included and safe and respected.
That's so true. And though there's always going to be conflict within a family or a team,
Sure.
So, does that mean that we just have to tolerate everybody's beliefs?
Absolutely not. That's the interesting thing about psychological safety, is that it doesn't preclude conflict. In fact, psychological safety encourages healthy conflict, because if you feel safe enough to disagree with somebody, even if you perceive that person as having more power than you, maybe that person does have more power than you. If you feel safe enough to disagree, even though everybody else holds the same opinion and you feel like the odd guy out, you're going to have conflict. But on teams that are psychologically safe, that conflict is healthy, that conflict is encouraged, and nobody is rejected from the group for starting that conflict or engaging that conflict, as long as it's respectful.
That's a very good answer. How do you think all this artificial intelligence will affect our human connections to our kids?
That is a great question. It's one we've been thinking a lot about. And in fact, the book came out well before ChatGPT. And had ChatGPT been around, I think we'd probably have to write another chapter. I go back to Fred in his parents' living room, seeing this technology that he just really didn't like. It scared him a little bit. And I think that's sort of the feeling that I had when I first tried artificial intelligence and first asked it to do things that I never thought it could do. And then it did them with flying colors, right? Fred found ways to make technology a positive force in children's lives. Now, he knew that even though he didn't like TV, it wasn't going anywhere. He knew it was going to be everywhere. Same thing today. Artificial intelligence is here. It's only going to get better and faster and more impressive. How is it that we adults can find ways to make that a positive force for kids? I don't have a great answer for that, but I think anything that works is going to do two things. It's going to free up teachers and parents to focus on what's uniquely human about their jobs. And that job is, forging connections with kids. If teachers don't have to grade 40 papers themselves, if something like ChatGPT can do that, what might that then free up that teacher to do? Will the teacher be able to get to know his or her students better? Probably. Will the teacher be able to have a better idea of where those students stand? Probably. I think artificial intelligence, if used wisely, can only enhance what's uniquely human about us. Those things, that can never truly be replaced by machines. I hope that's where this is all leading us. I don't have a good answer for that yet, but I do look to Fred as a sort of model for how to navigate a world that's suddenly inundated with a technology that we have no idea what to do with.
Well, because I think that AI cannot do precisely what you write about, and that is curiosity, creativity. It just repeats what's out there right now anyway.
Exactly. And there's an amazing study from Google that found that these things that Fred taught, curiosity, creativity, not only can it not be replaced by machines, that means it's only going to become more valuable as machines become more ubiquitous. So they did a study of who their best managers were. And the best managers at Google weren't necessarily the best computer programmers, right? Computer programming will eventually be done by machines. The best managers, the folks, the people at Google really, really wanted to work with were folks who were good listeners, folks who didn't judge their teammates, folks who made them feel psychologically safe, folks who just cared about the person sitting next to them, cared about their fellow employees and their well-being. All these things, again, that Fred taught so well for so long in the neighborhood.
That's great. And as a matter of fact, Tom Hanks says that your book is a real gift to the neighborhood.
We are so grateful to Mr. Hanks for that. He is a gift to all of us as well.
Also, let's talk a little bit about your own struggle to write the book. And in the acknowledgments, you admit that this is a mysterious world of publishing, and that you went through about 6 drafts to write the book. So how did all of that go? How did you find your agent, your publisher?
Sure. So first of all, I want to thank you for that question, because this book is now 2.5 years old. We've done a ton of interviews. Nobody has ever asked me about the acknowledgement section. So you are clearly a good, close reader. Thank you for that. It was difficult. I think that the most difficult thing, at least at first, was, how is it that Gregg and I can presume to write a book about one of the most beloved people on the planet, right? How could we ever do it justice, right? Fred Rogers is this amazing force in our culture, a force for good. And he's the only person that I know of who, when we talk about him, we have to emphasize the fact that he wasn't a saint, right? He was just a regular guy like everybody else.
Yeah.
So that's incredibly intimidating when somebody like that is your subject. And I think the only way we were able to do that is by having the blessing of Fred's wife, Joanne. Now, Joanne was an early champion for the idea for the book. We called right away and said, first of all, does this sound right to you? And is it okay if we do it? And her answer was an immediate yes. And of course, she wrote the foreword to our book, which in my opinion is the best couple of pages in the entire book.
Beautiful.
So knowing that we had her blessing really helped. I think it gave us a boost of confidence that we wouldn't have had otherwise. The second difficult thing was figuring out what Fred was doing and why. Because if you watch The Neighborhood, he's almost too good at blending the science with the art, right? You don't necessarily know that when there's a scene where he's watching paint dry, right? And he wouldn't necessarily know without understanding the science behind that he was teaching kids patience, and that he was showing children that sometimes when we don't have anything to do, that's where creativity starts to emerge. Once we realized that, actually Fred had an intention behind every little thing he did, then we realized, okay, we can go look at the science, we'll see Fred doing it, and that's what we'll write about. And once we had a format for the book, we open with a chapter that grounds you in the neighborhood, sort of takes you back there. Then we talk about the science, and then we profile different Fred-like people or Fred-adjacent people who are doing neighborhood-like things today. Once we had that sort of template for each chapter, it became a little bit easier. But the beginning, there were a lot of choices that had to be made. And we weren't always sure that we were making the right ones. And it really goes back to the blessing of Queen Sarah Saturday, Joanne Rogers herself, encouraging us and cheering us on. And our only regret is that Joanne passed away just a few months before the book came out. So we did not get to give her a final copy and say thank you. But we hope that we've kept her spirit and her husband's legacy alive in ways that she'd be proud of.
Ryan, tell me, how did you find your publisher? How did you find your agent?
Yeah, that's a great question, because I'm sure, like many of your listeners, we had no idea where to start, right? We had this idea, we thought it could be a good book, but we really didn't know how to even get started. The publishing world is so sort of opaque, and to us, it seemed secretive, and it's all based in New York, and we're here in Pittsburgh, and we just didn't know what to do. We had one very fortunate connection, and that is a person named Bill Eisler. Now, Bill was sort of Fred's right-hand man. He managed the business of the neighborhood. He was the first head of family communications, which was the production company formed to create Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. And, he was one of Fred's very best friends. And we're fortunate to know him. Bill lives here in Pittsburgh, still does amazing work. And he connected us to somebody at a publisher in New York, and just for an initial conversation. And I have to tell you, I was terrified for that conversation, because I was like, I don't know anything. We haven't written a book before. We're two totally unknown authors. And I hope that this encourages your listeners to some degree. They were so helpful. They were the nicest. I realized, again, they're just people, and they happen to be very nice people. And we had a great long conversation about, what our idea was at the time and how that idea might need to be tweaked in order to sell the book. It turned out to not be right for them at all. And that's totally okay. I think it was just the fact that they didn't shut us down right away. The fact that they were even willing to listen to our idea kept us going. And so eventually they offered to connect us to an agent named Jessica Papin. Jessica has been an amazing agent, and she worked with us to go through draft after draft of our book proposal. So your listeners probably know, when you write a nonfiction book, you start with a proposal, which is an extended summary of the book, but also a business plan. So how are you going to promote it, right? Who are you going to talk to? How are you going to get yourselves on TV or the radio? What are some ideas you might have for writing op-eds that you could then place in newspapers? All that sort of thing has to be thought about in advance. And then you write a sample chapter and you hand it off, and you hope somebody says, hey, these guys are competent enough to know what they're doing, or they're crazy enough to think that they can pull it off. Jessica helped us with the book proposal, which I think is a standard job of any agent. If you go to them with a idea that's not quite there, but they think that there's potential, they'll help you go back and forth with something that they think they can sell then to a publisher. So we submitted our many times revised book proposal to Hachette in September of 2019. And we ended up signing the deal, which was amazing. They gave us a deadline of September 2020, which was only a year after we signed the deal. And I remember thinking, there's no way we're ever going to get this done on time, right? That a year is just not enough time. In order to get this done, we'd have to clear our social calendars for a year. And then, of course, COVID broke out. So we had plenty of time on our hands, and we ended up getting the book done and turning it in on time. And it came out in April of 2021. So we had a lot of help along the way. I guess it's a long way of saying that, from Bill Eisler, this amazing person, to our agent, Jessica Papin, to the people who talked to us along the way, even though the book wasn't right for them, and ultimately to Hachette and our amazing editor there, Dan Ambrosio.
That's great. Well, I'm surprised. I thought that this was a new release, or are you releasing the paperback? Or
so it's interesting. So it came out in April of 21. And it came out to silence because of the pandemic. Our book tour had been canceled. All the promotional events we had, everything was canceled. And we thought, well, now what do we do? And so although the book came out in April 21, it really didn't begin to take off until things started to open up. And we started to get on the road and talk to teachers. And it has suddenly just taken on a life of its own. And a good problem to have as an author is that the hardcover was selling so well for so long that they delayed the paperback. Typically, the paperback comes about a year after the hardcover. So it is brand new in paperback, which is unusual for a book to have this sort of lifespan. So now it's got a whole nother life of its own because the paperback's a little bit less expensive. Schools, will buy it in bulk and conferences, and it just opened us up to a whole new audience.
That's wonderful.
Even though we've been talking about it for 2.5 years, it feels brand new. It's still so much fun, and we're still so grateful for this whole journey. And as long as people want to hear about Fred, we're happy to talk.
I really think you have.
Oh, thank you.
No wonder you're learning. And Ryan Rydzewski.
Got it.
Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Doris. It's been my pleasure.